We set off early in the morning, the 6 of us crammed into 2 cars, loaded with camping gear and snacks. It was supposed to be the perfect birthday weekend, a celebration under the stars. The forest we'd chosen was secluded, just what we wanted. I had no idea how quickly things would turn dark. The drive was filled with laughter and music. Matt and Sarah were singing off-key in the back seat, while Jenna argued with David over the best campfire recipes. Nate, my best friend since elementary school, was already planning the hikes we'd take. It felt good to be surrounded by friends, to be away from everything. We arrived at the trailhead around noon. The forest stretched out before us, its towering trees casting dappled shadows on the ground. There was no cell service, but we'd prepared for that. Jenna handed out walkie-talkies and we set off, following the trail to our chosen campsite. The hike was longer than expected, and by the time we reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping below the treetops. We set up our tents quickly and gathered wood for a fire. The air smelled of pine and earth, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. That night we celebrated. The fire crackled and the stars seemed to stretch endlessly above us. Nate handed me a flask and we toasted to another year. I felt lucky to have these friends, lucky to be here. But the feeling wouldn't last. It started with a sound. A distant rustling, faint but persistent. Probably an animal, David said, throwing another log on the fire. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew closer. Footsteps, snapping branches. We laughed it off, convincing ourselves it was nothing. We should have listened to our instincts. The first to go was Matt. He'd wandered off to grab more firewood and never came back. We called for him, our voices echoing through the trees, but there was no answer. "He's probably messing with us," Nate said, though he didn't sound convinced. By morning, Matt was still missing. We searched the surrounding area, but there was no sign of him. His walkie-talkie was dead, and the only thing we found was a pile of wood he'd gathered, abandoned by a nearby tree. The unease settled in like a weight on my chest. Sarah went next. She'd gone to the stream to refill our water bottles while we packed up camp. When we realized she'd been gone too long, we found her walkie-talkie lying on the bank, the water bottle still untouched. The forest felt different now, darker, more oppressive. "We need to stick together," Jenna said, her voice shaking. We decided to head back to the cars, abandoning the rest of the trip. But the trail seemed different, the markers we'd followed before now missing or moved. It was as if the forest was alive, conspiring against us. David disappeared that afternoon. One moment he was walking ahead of us, the next he was gone. His pack was left on the trail, straps torn as if by force. The air grew colder and the forest grew silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. Panic set in. Jenna clung to me, her nails digging into my arm. "We have to get out of here," she whispered. But every path we took seemed to lead us deeper into the woods. The trees pressed closer, their gnarled branches reaching like claws. That night, we made camp in a small clearing, too afraid to keep moving in the dark. The fire felt like our only protection against the encroaching darkness. We took turns keeping watch, but exhaustion won out. When I woke up, Jenna was gone. Her sleeping bag was empty, her boots still by the fire. I called for her until my voice was hoarse, but the forest swallowed my words. I was alone now, the silence around me deafening. Every shadow felt alive, every sound a threat. I tried to find the trail again, but the forest had changed. The trees seemed to shift, blocking my path. I stumbled upon symbols carved into their trunks, crude, jagged shapes that radiated malevolence. I felt eyes watching me, unseen but unmistakable. As night fell, I heard voices. Low, chanting voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I followed the sound, desperate for answers, and found myself in a clearing lit by torches. Hooded figures stood in a circle, their faces hidden in shadow. In the center of the circle was Nate, bound and gagged. His eyes met mine, wide with terror. One of the figures turned toward me and I saw their face, or rather, the lack of one. A smooth, featureless surface stared back at me. "You should not have come here," a voice said, deep and resonant. The figure's words echoed in my head, filling me with a primal fear. They stepped closer and I realized they were holding something. A knife, its blade black and gleaming. I tried to run, but the others surrounded me. Their chants grew louder, a cacophony of despair. Nate's muffled screams tore through the noise, and I fought against the hands that held me. The last thing I saw was the blade descending toward Nate. When I woke up, the forest was silent. The clearing was empty, the torches extinguished. My friends were gone, their fates a haunting unknown. I stumbled out of the woods as the sun rose, carrying with me the weight of their loss, and the knowledge that the forest was alive with something unspeakable.
The night was cool, the air crisp with the scent of pine and earth. I laced up my running shoes, the rhythmic sound of my footsteps echoing faintly as I jogged down the quiet road. The forest loomed to my left, its dense trees shrouded in darkness. Running at night was my escape, my way to unwind after a long day. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy of leaves, casting eerie shadows on the asphalt. I kept my pace steady, the sound of my breath and the occasional hoot of an owl keeping me company. The forest was alive in its own way, yet it felt unnervingly silent. As I rounded a bend, something caught my eye. A faint glimmer among the trees, like the reflection of light off metal. I slowed my pace, curiosity getting the better of me. Peering into the forest, I saw nothing but darkness. Shaking off the unease, I picked up my pace. But the feeling lingered, a sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I glanced over my shoulder. The road was empty, the shadows undisturbed. A low, guttural sound broke the silence, stopping me in my tracks. It was distant but unmistakable, like a growl but distorted. My heart raced as I turned toward the forest. The shadows seemed to shift, the trees bending unnaturally. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the light and my overactive mind. But the growl came again, louder this time, and I saw movement between the trees. Something massive, something wrong. It stepped into the moonlight, and my blood turned to ice. The creature was monstrous, towering at least 10 feet tall. Its 5 eyes glowed like embers, scanning the darkness with an unnatural intelligence. 8 arms, each ending in clawed hands, moved with eerie precision. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Then it let out a screech, a bone-chilling sound that shattered the night. My instincts kicked in and I ran. The forest seemed to close in around me as I sprinted down the road. The creature's footsteps were thunderous, shaking the ground. I could hear its guttural breathing, feel its presence growing closer. My lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest as I pushed myself harder. I veered off the road onto a narrow trail, hoping to lose it in the thick woods. The branches clawed at my face and arms, but I didn't dare slow down. The creature followed, its massive form tearing through the trees as if they were paper. Its glowing eyes were relentless, tracking me with terrifying precision. I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely keeping ahead. I burst into a small clearing, my chest heaving as I scanned for a way out. The creature emerged moments later, its form illuminated by the pale moonlight. It stood there, watching me, its 5 eyes unblinking. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The creature tilted its head as if considering my words. Then it lunged. I dove to the side, its claws narrowly missing me. Scrambling to my feet, I ran deeper into the forest. The trail disappeared, leaving me stumbling through the underbrush. My body screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. The creature was relentless, its screeches echoing in my ears. I tripped and fell into a shallow ravine, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I lay there, gasping as the creature approached. Its 5 eyes glowed brighter, its form towering over me. It reached down with one of its many arms, and I braced for the end. But it hesitated, its claws inches from my face. The creature made a sound, almost like a growl mixed with a hiss, before retracting its arm. It tilted its head again, its glowing eyes narrowing. Then it stepped back, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't wait to question my luck. Scrambling to my feet, I climbed out of the ravine and ran. The forest seemed quieter now, the oppressive presence of the creature gone. But the unease lingered, a weight in the pit of my stomach. I finally reached the road, the sight of the open asphalt bringing tears to my eyes. My car was parked where I'd left it, and I threw myself inside, locking the doors. My hands trembled as I started the engine and sped away. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The rearview mirror showed nothing but darkness, but I couldn't stop glancing at it. The creature's glowing eyes were burned into my mind. When I got home, I locked every door and window, pulling the curtains tight. But sleep wouldn't come. In the silence of my room, I heard it again, that low, guttural growl. And when I turned to the window, 5 glowing eyes stared back at me from the darkness.
The rain tapped gently against my apartment window as I sat on the couch, staring at the flickering flame of a single candle. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil in my mind. It had been years since that camping trip, but tonight, the memories felt fresh, raw, and inescapable. We had been so excited, a group of 6 college friends eager for a weekend in the woods. The idea was to escape the pressures of exams and deadlines, to reconnect with nature and each other. None of us could have imagined what awaited us. The campsite was beautiful, nestled deep in the forest, far from the city's noise. Tall pines surrounded a clearing where we pitched our tents. Laughter filled the air as we gathered wood for a fire, the smell of pine and earth grounding us in the moment. That first night, we sat around the fire, telling ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. The stars above were breathtaking, a blanket of light against the inky sky. We felt invincible, our bonds unbreakable, but the forest was watching, waiting. The first sign of trouble came the next morning. We found strange symbols carved into the trees around our campsite. They were intricate, almost ritualistic, and none of us could explain them. Nervous laughter brushed off our unease, but I could see it in their eyes. We were all scared. By the second night, the atmosphere had shifted. The forest felt darker, heavier, as if it were closing in on us. The fire crackled weakly, and the usual comfort of its warmth felt distant. Then came the noises, branches snapping, low whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. We tried to rationalize it. Probably animals, Jake said, though his voice wavered. Just the wind, Sarah added, clutching her flashlight. But deep down, we knew better. Something was out there. It was past midnight when the first scream shattered the silence. It was Emily. We found her tent torn open, blood staining the ground. Her body was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in as we realized we were being hunted. We huddled together, whispering frantic plans. "We have to leave," Mark insisted, but the nearest road was miles away. "We need to stay and fight," Anna argued, clutching a makeshift weapon. But nothing could have prepared us for what came next. The murderer emerged from the shadows, their figure cloaked in darkness. They moved with unnatural speed, their face obscured by a crude mask. Their weapon gleamed in the firelight, and their presence was suffocating. We scattered, running blindly into the woods. The trees seemed to shift, their gnarled branches reaching for us. I ran until my lungs burned, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, the screams of my friends echoed, one by one falling silent. I tripped, falling hard onto the forest floor. The world spun as I struggled to my feet, my body trembling. I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, drawing closer. The murderer's raspy breath filled the air. Desperation took over. I found a large branch and gripped it tightly, hiding behind a tree. As the footsteps grew louder, I swung with all my strength. The impact was sickening, and the figure stumbled, but they didn't fall. I ran again, tears blurring my vision. My friends were gone, their faces flashing in my mind. Guilt clawed at me as I realized I was the only one left. The forest was a maze, its shadows shifting, leading me deeper into its grasp. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning. My body ached, my mind teetering on the edge of collapse. Then I saw it, a small cave hidden by foliage. With no other options, I crawled inside, praying for safety. The cave was cold and damp, but it felt like a sanctuary. I huddled in the darkness, listening for any sign of the murderer. The forest was eerily quiet, the absence of sound more terrifying than the noise. Suddenly, a shadow appeared at the cave's entrance. My heart stopped as the murderer crouched, their mask glinting in the moonlight. They didn't enter, but their presence was a reminder that escape was impossible. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I awoke, the sun was rising. The murder was gone, but the forest still felt haunted. I emerged from the cave, my body heavy with grief and fear. I wandered until I found the road, my legs barely carrying me. A passing car stopped, and the driver's concerned face was the first sign of kindness I'd seen in what felt like an eternity. They took me to the nearest town, where I told the police everything. The murderer was never caught, and the bodies of my friends were never found. The forest kept its secrets. Now, years later, I sit in my apartment, the memories refusing to fade. The candle flickers, and I feel the forest watching me still. I survived, but a part of me never left those woods.